Hi, my name is Alex Casano, and I'm the events coordinator here at the Clearwater Historical Society. And today we will be having the Tampa Bay Automobile Museum coming to speak about their history and mission of the museum. So I hope you enjoyed this presentation. Thank you.
Good morning again. This is John Perrotta with the Tampa Bay Automobile Museum. That's our location. We're just east of Highway 19 and kind of northwest of Gandy Boulevard, tucked back in there in the Gateway Center. Been there for quite a few years. The museum is a privately owned, family-owned museum. All the cars in it, 75 cars, are all owned by the same family. The founder of the museum was born and raised and started his business in France, but in the mid-1970s he was doing so much work in the United States that he moved everything, even the family cars, from France to Florida. And the first four cars in the museum are the family cars that came with them. They became the beginning of the museum's collection. We focus on not just old cars, but cars that have some sort of innovative technology or creative engineering, something that at the time was new and different, like early front-wheel drive or rear engine, air cooling, use of aluminum, all kinds of different things that are more or less firsts in the automobile industry, and it kind of gave birth to the evolution of the automobile as we know it today. Today, front wheel is common. Front-wheel drive is common. Back then, very few cars had it. We have cars from 6 different countries. Most of the cars are from France because that's where the family came from for two reasons. For one reason. The other reason is because that's where front-wheel drive had its real start. We'll talk about that in a little bit. One of the interesting things we have is a steam-driven vehicle. This is a replica of a vehicle that was built in France by a man by the name of Nicolas Cugnot. It's called a fardier. The French didn't have a word for truck or for automobile way back then. Fardier was a heavy cart, so this was referred to as Cugnot's heavy cart. It's steam-powered. It has a boiler on the front. The 2 brass-colored cylinders behind the copper boiler are the steam pistons. And then there's a wooden frame and wooden wheels behind that. The owner of the museum went to the original is in a museum in Paris, the Museum of Science and Industry in Paris. It's in bad shape. It no longer operates. A lot of the parts were scavenged off it during the French Revolution. But the owner of our museum went to the museum in Paris. They allowed him to take measurements from the original. They gave him access to Nicolas Cugnot's original drawings. And he had the frame and wheels made in France using the same kind of wood that was used and the same construction methods. So this is a picture here of them getting ready to do one of the wheels. You can see the wooden wheel frame in the background. And that man is building a fire around the steel rim. And what he's going to do is get the rim very hot. It will expand. Then it'll be laid over the wooden wheel and water poured on it to cool it, and it will contract and adhere to the wheel. And then while it gets hot, everybody stands around and has a beer and watches the fire. There they are lifting the steel rim out of the fire and placing it over the wooden rim, and you can see the man on the right is pouring water on it to cool it down. And then you get a real good fit that way, and then you do the final fitting with a big hammer. When I put this presentation together, I started by I think, well, I'll just show some of the old cars we have in the museum and talk about the cars and what technology they have in them and so forth. Then I got to thinking, this is the Historical Society. A lot of the things that are interesting in our cars is the history behind the car. So back in the late 1970s, there was a show on the BBC called Connections. A British historian by the name of James Burke showed the apparently unrelated connections between different events in history. And it was a fascinating show. I used to love to watch it. It's still available on YouTube if you get interested. It's called Connections by James Burke. But what I thought I would try to do is show some connections between some of the vehicles in our museum. So not just the vehicles, but the historical connections between them. So this is a machine gun, a rotating barrel naval cannon built by the Hotchkiss Manufacturing Company. There is a connection between that machine gun and the 1958 Chevrolet. So what we're going to do is trace the connections between those two items. How do we connect a machine gun with a Chevrolet? We start by talking about Benjamin Hotchkiss. He was a gunsmith for the Union side during the Civil War, came from Connecticut, worked for a couple of different armaments companies. When the Civil War was over, the U.S. Civil War was over, he moved all of his operations to France in anticipation of the Franco-Prussian War. So he made armaments for the French during that war. When that war was over, like many companies that we'll see, he had died, but his company started making automobile parts for different manufacturers, and finally he started making his own cars in 1903. This is the logo of his company, and this is kind of interesting. There's another little interesting connection here. This is the logo that was on his cars, on the front of his cars, but it traces its history back to when he was an armaments manufacturer. You have two cannons and what they called a bomb at the 12 o'clock position, we would call a grenade today. But that logo became the logo for the U.S. Army's Ordnance Corps. The U.S. Army's Ordnance Corps still uses that same logo today. Another link in the connection is a man by the name of Jean-Albert Grégoire. He was a Frenchman. He did a lot of things. He was a very intellectual guy, a very smart guy. He was the guy who really started front-wheel drive, made it successful. He developed the first constant velocity universal joint. A CVU joint is in the front wheel of all front-wheel drive cars, and it's a particular joint that allows the front wheels of the car to both drive the car and steer the car. With rear-wheel drive, you don't have that. The rear wheels drive, the front wheels steer. And he also started a company called Tractor Automobiles. It was kind of an aside. He never made a whole lot of cars. But he was very intellectual in the development of front-wheel drive. Grégoire had influence in quite a few cars. I'm not sure whether all of this animation is going to work, but I'm just going to talk through the cars. Upper left-hand corner is an Adler. It's a German car that he licensed his constant velocity U-joint to many manufacturers. Adler was one of them. He never got paid. They cheated him out of his money. Another company, the red car in the upper right, is a Chenard and Walker. Nobody's ever heard of a Chenard and Walker. They don't make them. They haven't made them for years, but they also used his U-joint. The middle car on the left-hand column is a DKW, a German car that used his technology. And it's interesting, like all of the cars in this picture, we have that car in the museum, and it's the only car in our museum that is totally original. It has no restoration whatsoever on it. Middle car on the right-hand column is an Amilcar compound, which was interesting because it's called a compound because it used steel, wood, and aluminum in manufacturing the car. One of Grégoire's influencing features was that he liked to use aluminum. We'll see that in a little bit also. Bottom car on the left-hand side is the CGE Grégoire. CGE is the Compagnie Générale d'Électrique, France's General Electric company. He pioneered an electric car, battery-driven electric car back in 1971. They built 11 of those little cars. This is the only one left, and we have converted that car so that it gets its electricity from a hydrogen storage tank feeding a fuel cell. On the bottom right-hand side is another Citroën, another front-wheel drive car, and it is interesting. It used the tractor joints at the front, but Grégoire had also developed a unique rear suspension that would replace the original factory rear suspension and gave you a better ride and better handling. This is the rear of that Citroën 15 that has the logo on it that said Suspension Grégoire. In 1953, Grégoire and the Hotchkiss Company got together. The Hotchkiss Company had been building expensive cars, And in the late 1940s, early 1950s, they were not selling well in France because France was still recovering from World War II. So Hotchkiss was in financial trouble. They got together with Jean-Albert Grégoire and with the French Aluminum Company, the French equivalent of what we would call Alcoa in this country. They built a car called the Hotchkiss Grégoire, which is all aluminum. The fenders, hood, doors, roof, the whole car is aluminum. Even the frame is aluminum. The engine block is aluminum. They were trying to develop an interest in aluminum cars. So this is a 1953 Hotchkiss Grégoire. Next link in our connection series here is a man by the name of Ed Cole. Ed Cole was an engineer, came from Michigan, attended the General Motors Institute, which was a university owned by General Motors in Flint, Michigan, that specialized in teaching science, technology, engineering, and math, developing engineers for the General Motors company. Cole was pretty sharp. He was hired by GM before he actually graduated from school and went to work for the Cadillac division of General Motors, became the chief engineer for light tanks in 1943 for Cadillac. A lot of people don't realize that General Motors Cadillac division actually made tanks. There's a copy of one of their ads from some magazine in the late 1940s. So you could say that was probably the Cadillac of Tanks. I don't know. Go back to Ed Cole. He became chief engineer for Chevrolet in 1952 and president of General Motors in 1967. This is a picture of Ed Cole sitting in a 1953 Corvette, the first year of the Corvette, at the 1953 New York Auto Show. This is the show at which the Corvette made its debut, its public debut. And also, there's a picture of the same New York Auto Show, Jean-Albert Grégoire, at the auto show with one of his Hotchkiss Grégoires. I'm told that the two were displayed side by side. I don't know whether that's true or not, but in any event, Ed Cole saw the Hotchkiss Grégoire, fell in love with it, bought it, took it back to Michigan with him. Excuse me. The Hotchkiss Grégoire company folded. They never made a 1954 model. The company just died out. They couldn't sell cars. These were expensive to produce, and nobody was buying them. But there was something Ed Cole saw. This is the logo that was on the hood of the Hotchkiss Grégoire. And you can see in that logo that there's an animal. There's a current logo of that same animal. I don't know if any of you recognize that animal, but in 1958, when the Hotchkiss Grégoire's company's copyright had ended on their logo, Chevrolet came out with the first Impala. We have several unique vehicles in the museum, one-of-a-kind type vehicles. The one in the upper left is that CGE Grégoire I mentioned that has it's rear-wheel drive, battery-powered, but it uses hydrogen as the source of its electricity. A lot of people, there's a lot of interest in hydrogen now as a fuel. Some people say it's the fuel of the future. Some people say, yeah, that's right, but it always will be. There's a lot of skeptics. But it actually runs. We've had it up and down on the road. All of the cars in our museum have license plates, and they're all registered. They all get driven regularly. This is another interesting, unique car that we have in the museum. This is a 1965 Ford Mustang. It's the only all-wheel drive Mustang built. It was done as a prototype to determine whether it would work real well and what it would cost. It does work extremely well. It's one of the family's favorite cars to drive. But Ford figured that if they were going to offer front or all-wheel drive as an option, it would cost at least $500, and they didn't think anybody would pay $500 for an option on a car that only sold for $2,500 to start with. So it never went into production. But this is the only one built. This is a 1925 Gerin. It's the only Gerin, Gerin. You never heard of it. Jacques Gerin was a mathematician and aerodynamicist for a company called Avion Voisin. We'll get to them a little bit later. A French airplane manufacturer, built planes for the British and the French in World War I. When the war was over, Avion Voisin began building cars. We'll see one of theirs in a little bit. And Jacques Gerin went off on his own and dissipated the family fortune trying to engineer his own car using what he learned building airplanes. That has an aluminum frame, rear engine. He never completed it. He never got a body on it. His intent had been to cover the body with oiled canvas, the way they built airplanes back then, wood frames covered in oilcloth. This car has an interesting story. It was discovered in a barn in London several years ago, and somebody took a picture of it and wrote into a British car magazine and said, "Look what I found in a barn. I think it's a such and such and so and so." Somebody else wrote in a subsequent month, "No, it's not a such and such and co. It's the such and such and so and so. It's the 1925 Gerin, which has been missing since about 1926. Nobody knows where it was." So it went up on auction, and we were able to buy it and bring it in our museum, and we are modernizing it. We are going to put a body on it. We've got it where it actually runs. It's registered. We can take it out on the road and drive it. We have. Yep, we skipped one. This is a 1946 Mathis. It is a three-wheeled vehicle. Again, it's all-wheel drive, front-wheel drive. It was built in secret during the German occupation of France in World War II. The Mathis company before World War II had been the fourth largest manufacturer of cars in France. They built this during World War II, during the German occupation, thinking that the French would need a lightweight, economical car when the war was over, that there wasn't going to be a lot of money spent on cars. And they were right. It's all aluminum, so it's lightweight. It gets very good gas mileage. It's three wheels so that it can be registered as a motorcycle, and you save money on your taxes, your insurance, and in some places you didn't even have to have a license to drive a motorcycle. Here we go. This is a 1931 Ford Model A, and the picture on the right is the back end of this car. After World War I, fuel was extremely scarce in Europe. Thousands of cars and trucks and buses were converted to run on coal, charcoal, wood, even nutshells. This car runs on charcoal as well as gasoline. The unit on the back, the black box on the back on the left of the back end, is a charcoal burner. You load it with charcoal, light it on fire. There are no vents in it like what you'd have in your backyard grill, so the charcoal cannot completely burn. The charcoal that's lit at the bottom heats the charcoal above it, causes it to give off primarily methane and carbon monoxide. Those two gases are pulled by a blower from the burner through that cylinder on the right-hand side, the green cylinder, which filters the particulate matter out of the fumes and then blows it to the front of the engine. So you can run your engine on charcoal. If you look on the top of the car, those are bags of charcoal. That's the fuel tank. The car will actually run on both, on either gasoline or charcoal, whichever you have access to. Another interesting set of connections, automobiles and the military. We've already seen how Hotchkiss and General Motors had military connections. Several of our other cars have military connections also. BSA is Birmingham Small Arms. When I was a kid, BSA motorcycles were the hot motorcycles they have, BSAs and Triumphs. We never knew what BSA stood for, but they made muskets for the British early on in the late 1880s. You can see on the right-hand side their logo is three stacked muskets. On the bottom left is a BSA three-wheeler. Another economical car could be registered as a motorcycle, made mostly of wood and covered with fabric. There it goes. This is a 1938 Volkswagen Prototype. Hitler had wanted what he called a people's car, a low-priced car that everybody in Germany would be able to drive. Dr. Porsche developed the Volkswagen, what we call the Beetle today. That's the man directly behind the car, the shorter man without a hat, is Dr. Porsche. The man to the left of them with the hat, that's Hitler. They're both examining the 1938 Volkswagen. Never went into production in 1938 because in 1939 Germany invaded Poland and then invaded Czechoslovakia. World War II started. Dr. Porsche had developed a powertrain for the Beetle that he convinced the German army to use for what they called their Kubelwagen, which is the German equivalent of our Jeep. And that has the four-cylinder air-cooled rear engine powertrain from a Volkswagen in the back end of it. It's a two-wheel drive. It's not a four-wheel drive the way our Jeeps were. And in effect, he used the German army to proof test or debug the powertrain for what would become eventually the 1949 Volkswagen Beetle. That was the first year of production of the actual Volkswagen. I mentioned Avion Voisin earlier. There's a picture of one of their, what they called a bomber. Basically, it was a fly over the enemy and throw things out over the side when you flew over them. It was not what we would call today a bomber. The car in the lower right-hand corner is a Voisin automobile that they started building after World War I. That's a 1927, and it is built the same way they built airplanes. It has a wooden frame, and the skin is oiled cloth. We don't have a Jeep in our museum, but I stuck the Jeep in here because the U.S. Army's Jeep, all-wheel drive Jeep, used the same tractor joints that had been developed by Jean-Albert Grégoire for his early front-wheel drive cars. The actual Jeep was developed by a company called American Bantam, but they didn't have the production capability to make everything that the U.S. military needed. So Willys and Ford were hired to build Jeeps. We built a total of 650,000 of them during World War II. We're back here to this Model A, and I stuck this in because this is another interesting connection between the military and an automobile. The aftermath of war requires you to do a lot of make-do things like how do we get around when we don't have gasoline. Detroit became known as the arsenal of democracy. All of these manufacturers that were automobile manufacturers converted their production to build weapons. When I started this and I was doing some research on who had done what, I got to thinking about, my first thought was that we could never do that again. We could never convert all of our manufacturing to support a national crisis. And then it suddenly occurred to me that, we just did that. We just had automobile parts manufacturers in Kokomo, Indiana, building ventilators. And we had underwear manufacturers in South Carolina making masks. When things get tough, despite all of the divisiveness and conflict in the country today that we read about, when the times get tough, we can come together and do the right thing. The B-29 bomber had parts from all of those manufacturers in it. Another interesting connection with automobiles and military, this is kind of a tangential type connection. In July 7th, 1919, the U.S. Army's Transcontinental Motor Company started a trip from Washington, D.C. to San Francisco. There were no roads that went across the country. In many places, they had to build their own roads. They went 3,200 miles in 62 days. 12 of the vehicles didn't make it. They damaged 88 local bridges. But they did go all the way from Washington, D.C. to San Francisco. And it was interesting that one of the participants in that trip was at that time a captain, ended up President of the United States, Dwight David Eisenhower. Their route went through all of these states, very simple one-way trip. Thanks to Eisenhower, we now have what we call the Interstate Highway System, 48,000 miles of roads connecting us east to west and north to south. Beautifully engineered curves for intersections that really enhance our ability to get around and build some massive traffic jams if things don't go exactly right. Finish up with the logo of the museum. Our logo has two vehicles on it. The upper left vehicle is a Hotchkiss Gregoire. It's built of aluminum, front-wheel drive, front engine, water-cooled. Lower right-hand corner is a Tatra, a Czechoslovakian car. Everything is completely the opposite. Both of them extremely interesting vehicles. Neither one of them built today. Tatra made a lot of cars. Hotchkiss Gregoire made very few. Tatra cars, the Tatra T87 was one of the favorite cars of German officers to drive after they invaded Czechoslovakia. But because it was a rear-engined car, it didn't handle the way everything else did. And a lot of the officers lost control of the car in a corner. And the rumor is that Hitler finally forbade his officers to drive the Tatras because he was losing too many officers. Jay Leno has a video in which he states that during the first week of the invasion of Czechoslovakia, Hitler lost more officers to Tatra than he lost to the Czech army. And that's the end.